And we're live on YouTube. Welcome everyone to another NPM Open RFC call. Today's date is Wednesday, April 20th, 2022. We'll be following along in the agenda that was posted in the NPM RFC's repo, issue number 574. And quick reminder, these calls and all comms on the NPM RFC's repo are covered under code of conduct. We ask you please be kind on these calls, and if someone else is talking, please raise your hand and we'll call on you to speak. Quickly for folks that have just joined, I will share the meeting notes doc. Feel free to add yourselves to that as attendees, and we'll be jumping in just a second. One quick announcement I want to make, and I shared, I think, a couple weeks back, our team has put together a long list of items that we're hoping to queue up for NPM v9. So there's a number of breaking changes and a number of sort of chores and to-do items around changing some defaults to configs, flipping some bits. So just a quick reminder to go check that out if you're interested in what we're hoping to queue up here in the next few months. And I think that's it that I know of. Did anybody else have any announcements they want to share? I guess one quick reminder as well, the OpenJS World Conference is coming up, and I know that a few folks from our team will be headed down to Austin to join much of the Node ecosystem, hopefully in person for the first time in a long time. And that will be nice to see some familiar faces and hopefully some new faces as well. So that's in early June. I believe it's June 6th. Somebody could correct me if I'm wrong. But just wanted to make a note of that. Our very own Miles Borns will be speaking about supply chain security, which is very relevant these days at that conference. So quickly, let's jump into the agenda we have here. The first item that we have was the command-specific configuration. I know I unfortunately wasn't able to make the call last week as I was out sick, but I know there was a bit of discussion around this. Jordan, I believe you had made the initial note when I pushed this RFC that why the heck have we not had this forever? And I apologize that that's not the case, but I was just wondering if there was any comments from last week that were surfaced sort of with concerns. I saw there was a note about holding off on actually landing this feature until V9 potentially, if we consider it to be a breaking change, but.
Yeah, I think the commentary that's popped up on the issue since is worth talking about. For example, like npm, when you run npm publish, it runs npm pack implicitly, and if I put pack specific config, obviously when I run npm pack, that should work. It should run it or should use it. But if I run npm publish, should that also use the pack specific config? And I feel like my gut reaction is yes, of course. npm publish, if npm install ran npm ls implicitly, I would expect npm install to use the ls specific config and so on. However, I'm not 100% confident that that's actually the case. It's just my intuition. And the reason I'm not confident is because the reason that I've wanted this RFC for years is because I actually wanted my invocations to use different config, and I wanted that to be reified in the repo in npm RC so that every developer in the repo didn't have to think about it. And it's possible that in my specific case, there's a conceptual difference enough that even if npm publish invoking npm pack uses pack specific config, like even if that philosophy is applied everywhere, maybe my use case would still be fine. But I think it's worth auditing all of those implicit relationships of which commands invoke which other commands. Whether they actually do or not is irrelevant, but conceptually, I think just to make sure that if everyone agrees with my gut reaction, just to make sure that that is actually the right thing to do.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with this. My comment back there was about this because I know Dom brought it up. Dominicus. Like, I guess I am interested in right now in how we handle this because I know that there's specific like boundaries, like domain boundaries that we do cross, like when we are spawning like a new command. And I'm not sure if we do share config completely between those boundaries. A good example of that is installing Git dependencies, let's say, and not passing along the ignore scripts flag. Potentially there's other reasons why we may not be wanting to share configuration for, let's say, npm install or some subsequent, let's say, install and test. Let's say you want to add or provide registry configuration for npm install. You do not want that to then be shared with test. So npm it shouldn't, npm test should not maybe have registry configuration or information passed to it, right? So that the idea of cascading or sharing the config, I think is I don't think makes sense. I think that you should have to explicitly define, let's say, if you want to have configuration that will work for both those use cases, which is npm install and npm pack, and npm install and npm test, then you would essentially double up on the configuration in the npm RC file if that's the way you wanted that. Right. I think that would be the most explicit way and help ensure that there wasn't like any unknown sort of like shared config across those things.
But the flip is that then the infra team who has to configure npm RC for their 1,000 like coworkers has to know that if somebody types npm it, which is install-test, that they may need to duplicate their install config and their test config, like otherwise something horrible will happen, like potentially. So like it is definitely more explicit and powerful to do that, but it's also like a potential huge foot gun because there is this interrelation, like dependency web conceptually, of like a bunch of different commands that conceptually invoke a bunch of different other ones. And like, I don't think anybody has all of those in their head. Like I wouldn't be surprised if half the npm team didn't even know that npm it existed, right? Like, anyway.
Yeah. So, and sorry, I know Roy's got his hand up. I think what you just said though was, I'm still suggesting that you can, when you run npm it, it's going to load the configuration for npm install and npm test, but those would be separate, right? So if you had npm it configuration, it wouldn't be passed on down to those, like essentially that specific command. Yeah, so that specific command configuration is actually almost useless because all that it does is shell out to spawns, install, and test, right? Right. Go ahead, Roy.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight there is also different types of relationship between each of these commands. Like the relationship between, let's say, npm init and exec is kind of very different from the example you gave, Darcy, of installing Git dependencies, where the client is actually spawning another npm install for installing the dependencies of that Git dep. So I think we also need to map the type of relationships, not only what are the relationships, but also the type, because some of them are really tied together, like exec, like both of them share the internal libnpm exec module. So it's basically the same thing internally, but yeah, so should it forward configs or not? Yeah.
So how can we move forward then with this RC? What needs to be specified about what's missing from the document today that we should outline? You're saying all commands relationships should be mapped out, like, and should that be mapped out here, like essentially?
Yeah. Like an audit. Because like my hope is that what we will find is like what you're describing, that like it conceptually calls install and test. So if you run it, it pulls in the install config and the test config, and also the it config, right? All those different complexities. It's possible it'll all just work out and it'll all make sense, but like, it's probably worth making sure.
Okay. See if I can use Mermaid.js to map that, make a nice diagram, and have it render nicely here in Markdown, just to make my life a little bit easier and not to have to go between tooling. Okay, so I've added an action item for myself to take this away, to do this work, and potentially with the team also get some help doing this. I think in general, it's a good exercise, but I would like, and could be live somewhere else even entirely, that kind of mapping, but I'd like to at least attach it to this work item so that like it gets done, because something like this often like just lingers, something like, hey, let's go and audit all the lifecycle events. It's like, okay, but if we attach it to a specific work item, then I think that it's actually going to get done. So
yeah, to be clear, I think it would be a useful thing to keep have an updated thing like that around at all times.
In docs,
but I think that the design of this command specific config must be blocked on it in order to know for sure that it's being designed correctly, because once we ship something here, we probably can't easily get rid of it.
Yeah. Okay. I totally agree. So that's the next step there, is to document that and those relationships. And yeah, we should have I want to have a really rock solid like RFC for this. So it's extremely clear like what config is shared and what's like not, essentially, like, so cool. Moving on, I think, unless anybody else had any other comments on command specific config. No. Moving on to one of the another exciting, I guess, RFC that I've proposed here. This is 564, the dependency selector syntax and npm query command. I'll reference it here for folks. And want to, I guess, open up the floor for some discourse on this. I know, Jordan, you've given some feedback, which I haven't been able to get to all of it, but maybe you could highlight maybe a few of the items that you're really, you had questions
about. We talked about this a bit last week. I think the two main things is the functionality for like class selection makes perfect sense to me, but I think the terminology is vastly overloaded and needs to be avoided very strenuously. So I think we need to come up with, I think NPM should come up with our own names for what these things are, that is completely distinct and separately Googleable and learnable from CSS syntax. And it's fine, or CSS terminology. It's fine if we use CSS syntax and just say CSS class syntax is NPM category syntax, or I don't know, whatever. But I think that's really important, because the word class needs to just stop being used for things. And then the other item was, I talked about ESLint as an example. They have a no restricted syntax rule, which takes AST node selectors. And by adding this rule, that allowed them to decline a lot of feature requests with, oh, you can just use an AST selector and a custom message, and then we don't need to make a rule for it, which is good in some cases because it would have been a dumb rule. And it was terrible in other cases because it was a really good rule to have. And there were actual reasons why a rule would be better. But the existence of the selector syntax sort of created those unintended consequences. And it seems awesome if this npm query thing exists, and if almost all the npm commands can be rewritten in terms of it. Like, I see the value there, right? That tickles a lot of ideological, like, checks off a lot of ideological boxes for programmers, right? To, have it all consolidated like that. But I do worry that that will create a world where the npm team sees the marginal utility of adding a specific command versus telling people to just use an npm query command is so small that a bunch of important new commands might not be added in the future. So I wanted to like just bring up the concern about that chilling effect.
Go ahead, Tierney.
I definitely want to speak to that. I can totally see where that's coming from, and I'm trying to look at it at least in a very different way, where I see this as a very good way to begin to prototype things and find what can be added much faster and significantly reduce the barrier to adding those things. So, for example, the audit licenses stuff, the way the query language is defined right now, that could be added with an alias to a query in. I mean, this is all theoretical, but that's one query, right? And I think that's a particularly strong thing in actually shipping things faster. And I agree that this has to be an ideological thing from the team that, yes, we will ship things as aliases. I think that's an important thing. And I think that's a good distinction to make. Not necessarily commitment, but like understanding of where the team stands on that, I think is really good to have. And yeah, I'd been assuming or operating under the assumption that kind of thing will ship more often, faster. And so, yeah, I guess I would also like clarification on that, but in talking with Darcy about this and stuff, my assumption is that it is kind of, we'll be able to ship stuff faster now. So.
Yeah, if we have to add that to the RFC explicitly to say this is to expedite the evolution of and sort of, determination of what information is important, that we make top level commands and alias sort of these things, because we don't want to make it harder. And we also don't want to have an unbound top level alias. So that is what we've pushed against for a long time, against the Yarn strategy of not controlling our top level subcommands and that namespace. So we are mindful about what does eventually become a subcommand, and that this at least unlocks a new ability for the community to self-serve in a lot of cases, and then come to us and propose new standard queries that should exist and shouldn't have to be copy and pasted everywhere. But
yeah, and you're describing the existing bar for new subcommands, and I think that is an appropriate good bar. I think NPM's doing a great job with that, like letting in some things, saying no to many. My concern is that the fact that NPM query exists would be used as effectively as a reason alone why not to add a subcommand. And if the NPM team is willing to effectively commit to not ever using that as a reason not to do it, there's plenty of other reasons not to add a new subcommand, right? Like, and those already are there, and those will be there with or without NPM query. I'm just saying I don't want the rubric for top level subcommands to change. Like in other words, for NPM audit licenses, should we add it is one question. How do we add it is a different question. I completely agree. NPM query answers the second one in a very dissatisfying way. I want to make sure it doesn't affect the first one.
If we are, I do not like the idea of like grandfathering anything or grandparenting anything into existence, which creates this like why do we what's special about, let's say, test and etc. So I'm totally okay with us adding into the criteria here that like we have some sort of it almost sounds like a separate RC or like a separate like how we do make decisions that isn't documented, but like I'm okay with us saying that this will never affect our decision making around not that it will never, but we will get way more like my expectation is that this will exponentially increase the capabilities and understanding of the community around like it's going to, I hope, level up our understanding of packages in our projects, right? And it's going to allow you to unlock a bunch of answers that have been hidden behind tooling that does or doesn't have certain capabilities. And that is something that we've struggled with exactly the question of should or shouldn't we add a new command to NPM. We have a slow process here with the RFC process. If we give you the tool to essentially go write some command to unlock that information for yourself and self-serve, like, this is going to, it's obviously going to expand how often folks are asking us, can you just alias this one thing?
Yeah, totally.
So it's not that I just want to be mindful, like we're locking ourselves into saying we won't use the fact that you can do that with npm query as a reason why we would say no, but we are definitely going to see expanded asks.
Totally. Yeah.
Right?
All I'm asking for is for the rubric to be unchanged, not for it to be loosened or tightened. And I just wanted, if I didn't say anything, my concern would be that it would implicitly be tightened, and I didn't want that.
Okay.
But yeah, I agree I'm happy to hear all those expectations. That would be an ideal outcome. And I'm not looking to see an explosion of subcommands. I just don't want to close off potential useful ones that might come up in the future.
Cool. Yeah, I still see there being future for like more subcommands that are similar to, let's say, list, outdated, update, and like all that, all the ones that we expect that we can alias and like essentially shell out to the new query capabilities. There was one thing that I did want to note that was brought up, I think, by yourself, Jordan, as well, which I wanted to speak to and maybe speak about. So there was the class syntax, the class sort of understanding of which classes are available to end users, because essentially there is no like DOM, there's no actual like user generated content there. Beyond that, there's also the understanding of anything that exists within a package JSON, it will be available to you to do attribute selection. And within the RFC, I explicitly came up with, during a pairing session with Roy, came up with an idea to allow you to iteratively select attributes. And this is through a almost pseudo selector syntax, which expands upon like some sort of known patterns within CSS for pseudo selectors, but gives you the ability to essentially select array values and also objects, or arrays of objects and their values. And so the one thing to note there is that there is a concern, I think, around like the unbounded sort of keys that could exist within package JSON, and potentially any keys that we are considering are like blessed, right? That could or couldn't exist. So I'm just wondering, like, I think that I saw some questions around that, but I'm not sure if other folks have seen or read that specific area.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main alarm bell that I was asking the question about was, in the same way that test, start, stop, and a few other build or a few other commands are like, or a few other npm scripts are special because they have top level subcommands, and they arguably shouldn't be. I don't want to see a world where some things are special and other things aren't. And so if we're going to bless specific package JSON fields, then I think that it becomes, in any way, even if there's a escape hatch for everything else, then I think that it becomes incumbent on npm to it would become incumbent on npm to actually like have a pretty expansive list of known package JSON fields. And that's a long list. Node looks at a few, TypeScript looks at some, bundlers look at some, like there's just a long, and that seems to be not a scalable approach. And so it seems like it would be better to come up with something where no attribute names are special. And if you have brackets or quotes or whatever, but like all of them use that, even the ones, even like name and version, even though those are special, right? Like, just because then it is an intentionally unbounded and egalitarian set of package JSON attribute names. And there's no question about what works. It's just, if it's a thing, it works. Like, it just has to be JSON,
Yeah, so this is exactly where I was going with like this train of thought and sort of what you're saying. So originally we enumerated all the fields that we are known today, which we document within the package.json docs and npm's docs, and then which we're aware of for most projects. This, I think, needs to be probably taken out. And what I would love to introduce in its place, like you say, is actually it's not necessarily net new. Actually, this exists in CSS, but an adder pseudo class. So essentially, that would create a pseudo class with bracket notation that you would then pass the attribute selector. So take what I was speaking to before, the syntax that we have cobbled together here for selecting arrays of values and doing attribute selection in that way, and put that into and nest it essentially in this adder, which is an attribute pseudo class. This would then expand to and allow for any fields to exist within package.json, and we respect them all equally, no matter what. And I think that would solve sort of that problem, and we would have no known attributes that we essentially privilege over any others.
And I guess that it would be fine, as I'm saying this, like as we're saying this, it would be fine to have special syntax like the ID selector or the dot selector. Like it's fine if those have, sort of bless specific package.json fields like name or version or dependencies or whatever, because those are kind of always inherently a part of NPM. But like when you're doing that, you're using special syntax. You're not typing name in a different way than you're typing like Jordan, right? Or whatever package.json field you want. And so like, I think it's okay to have some differentiation there because it's NPM and you can't get around that. But I want it. Yeah. Like, so that's fine. But if there was another, like, let's say you were going to do like hash low dash at 1.2.3, that's a special way to write name and version. But I think that's okay if we wanted to do it, because it's like, yeah.
So I just provide two examples in chat. The current one is how we originally have this documented. So just like a CSS attribute selector here, it's the key and then the value. And in the case of what I would be recommending in the future would be utilizing a pseudo class like the attribute pseudo class that would then take that exact same attribute selector as its value and match to that. And the interesting part here is that this could then, we could use essentially the same generic pseudo selector, not generic pseudo selector, but the generic like array and object selection inside of that, which I'll reference here for folks. So it sounded like you were like for one way, but now you've kind of walked that back, Jordan. You're actually okay with.
Yeah, it's I in other words, I'm fine if there's special selector syntax that happens to mean a field name without mentioning it. But if a field name is actually present in the query, then I think all field names should be done the same way. So like name, if you have the word name there in the query, meaning the attribute, it should look the same as any random attribute you can come up with. But if we had a shortcut like the hash and it meant name or something, like that's fine because you can look up what that syntax means and you know what it means, and name is special. But like when you type it out, it wouldn't be. That's sort of where I'm adjusting to.
Yeah. And I would say that I see right now, and what we're talking about, I see right now a problem with like essentially a namespace being clobbered in the generic, like the way that I've proposed the generic attribute and object sort of an array selection, value selection. So that needs to be solved for. So I do think that the nesting actually helps, like having a blessed attribute selector, query selector would actually solve some of the generics problem with I'm seeing here. But then we could still have top level. We can have both of these things, I guess, is what I'm saying. They both could work and live alongside of each other. Just that the top level only works for known values, potentially, like the known what the keys that we've essentially described here today. And in the future, we could potentially bless future keys that we know live in package.json that also could be utilize the attribute selector syntax out of the box. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'll probably need to re-review once it's all typed out, but that sounds right.
Yeah, so it seems like there's an edit that needs to be done here. Is I guess what I'm saying for sure. Awesome. Did anybody else have any other feedback they want to give to this proposal? If not, we can move on then. So I'll take the action item to update this based on some of that feedback to try to solve this one issue that I know exists, and also to outline the fact that the introduction of npm query should not affect essentially our decision making for future top level commands, and explicitly note that. Okay. Moving on to our RFC 559. So expanding the behavior of before. I'm not sure if this was spoken about last week. I'm not sure if you folks took some time to talk about this.
Yeah, briefly.
So
I think
go ahead.
I think my thought was that currently it has the nice symmetry of whatever you can pass to new date in JavaScript is what before supports, and that's it. And so it always works that way. And that there's a new date object temporal, it's like 7 or 8 new objects coming to JavaScript at stage 3. I don't think they support this sort of relative stuff, but they do support different syntax. And it seems a little weird if npm moves from supporting date to supporting something that's not temporal. And when you get into like relative date things, like, I don't know, there are standards for how to describe those things, and temporal uses them. And I don't think, I don't know, it seems worth just exploring that and making sure that it would be a fine symmetry if before takes anything you can pass to new date or anything you can pass to this temporal method, right? And if it allows for the same relativity, but I don't know if that would have the same consistency with the Unix date command either. So it's just kind of a tricky place to get into. That's all I brought up.
It does seem like in terms of the nomenclature, I guess, like that could be used or changed. It would be like from, I think temporal uses from, I think, as the method that you pass for a relative,
yeah, on each of the top level classes, there's a from static. Yeah,
right. So whatever from essentially could supports is sort of maybe what we should be supporting with any changes here, or any kind of net new flag that would kind of affect before, right? So before and from, I don't know. That's how I'm seeing it. But I'm aligned with you in terms of we should probably do something that's bespoke and try to align with what's going to land.
Right. And then I rereading it, the other concern I'd had was, I think Miles came up with this after there was a one user request in particular where they wanted to essentially permanently time delay all their installs. So everything is installed as if it were a week ago at all times. And the hope for the user, which you can do with before, you just have to dynamically come up with the value. And before relative here would let you permanently enshrine this in npm RC. And their reasoning was, oh, well, if I wait a week, then all the vulnerabilities will have been caught by then, right? And that's only true when most people aren't waiting a week. Meaning, if we add this feature, somebody will write a blog post saying, do this in your npm RC, and all the vulnerabilities will be caught before you do it. And then at some point, enough people will do it, and it will now take 7 days instead of 1 hour, 1 day to catch all the vulnerabilities. So, all being in air quotes. So that's worth thinking about, is that like, is the use case that like, how could the use case be abused? Right. And certainly I've had it's nice to be able to say like 1 day ago, 2 days ago, and I've had to manually edit the date to like get what I want. And I don't even know how to use the Unix date command. So that would have probably been easier, but like, so I see the benefit there. It's just, I'm not sure if the risks are going to be worth it.
Yeah. I guess the risk though is that the community at large begins to have a pattern of behavior to which they could do today as well, through like, even like, because you can do this not easily, but you could still be doing this, like it is possible utilizing before, right, to have a relative timestamp generated for you. It's just not like I guess I'm saying is it's just not that easy. So what is the risk really made worse by making it a little bit easier to add this in? So I thought actually my concern with this, with the framing that this is installing, specifically the framing that before helps you install packages as if they were a week ago. My concern with this feature is that it's just not true, because there are mutable packages potentially within your graph that references to tar files, references to get deps. Yeah. That is, to continue to, I guess, speak to before as if it is actually giving you a locked in
right. I mean, it's only for registry deps, but I think that the occurrence of non-registry deps in a graph is pretty rare. And so like, I agree with it about the risk of like propagating that misunderstanding, but I also think it's not in practice that big a difference. But to be clear, what I'm saying is with before right now, you can't put anything in your NPM RC that just works and sticks you to a week ago. You have to hard code a date, and because you can't interpolate the date value in the NPM RC. So like, it's not practical to do this right now. And this RFC would make it possible in a way that it's not. So like, it's not just a convenience to do an existing thing. It's actually a brand new capability.
I mean, other than passing it always in the command line, but yes, you can't do it today with the npm-rc file, right? So, yeah, I'm totally okay with this. Otherwise, though, like I don't actually, I actually think that, sure, this adds some value, I guess. My concern with saying I've seen many references to not registry deps in graphs. So like that's my take is that actually that's way more prevalent than folks think it is, and that's way scarier for folks, and should be much more on the radar of our team, at least, to be helping try to make the community aware that certain tools that we build and features that we build only work in for certain types of dependencies and certain types of packages. And that, if you are reliant on tar or like tar references or like git deps, like you're in trouble.
That actually makes me wonder, has there ever been any talk about a config option that basically fails the install if there are any non-registry deps in the graph? Because I never want that.
I've been talking about this. You would not want that, or you would want that?
No, I would want the config as a way to tell me which package authors I have to yell at, and as a way to enforce that no new crappy dependencies are added into my tree. Sorry, non-registry dependencies are added into my tree.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a good RFC.
Yeah, I'll let someone else write it maybe, but noted.
Yeah, so part of this does go back to the npm query discussion, right? So if you could easily write npm query type get, or not type whatever we have like 6 known types that we define with npm package arc, and you could essentially enumerate quite quickly with npm query which and be able to find out which packages do or don't or aren't get types or direct target references. So so yes, let's take the action item to, I think, do that separately from this. And then in terms of action items for this proposal, I think because it's an RFC, we can ask either Miles or whoever's picking up this work to create an actual RFC with the proposal for the flag, ideally trying to mimic any kind of temporal implementation, specifically probably the from syntax, whatever is supported there, would make sense to me, because we would essentially be using the current date time as the initial new date, and then using from to essentially do.
Well, and there's a duration class. So like what I'm sort of thinking is that we support whatever duration.from does and treat it as a go. So if you say 3 minutes, it's three minutes ago, and so on. And
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other feedback on this? I know that both of these items, even the next one as well, was related to improvements to before. We've kept both of them on the agenda, but they're pretty much tied together. Ideally, we'll close both once we have an RFC. Cool. Moving along, we have about 15 minutes left to our RFC 548. This is adding flag for running commands in transitive dependencies. I'll share that with folks. This is essentially a feature has been on our radar since we started building out workspaces. Lerna has the capabilities to run scripts and build dependencies based on dependents. And I don't know if this was brought up last week, but I know we did speak about it a couple of weeks back. I didn't know where we netted out in terms of support for this. I'm not sure if Luke, you potentially, I think, were speaking up at that point. Maybe not.
I don't think I've seen this one yet.
So yeah, so this is an idea of almost like there's pipelines, not pipelines, but yeah, like essentially to run a script or run a build, you might have sort of a chain of dependencies that need to be built before that you can actually execute that script within like your workspace, for example. And so I think in Lerna, they had a flag called include dependencies that could be passed when you were running that script, that then would essentially walk the chain of dependencies and run those in sequential order.
Yeah, so I guess 2 weeks ago I posted this comment saying that it's sort of like include dependencies, but then the other thing I'd talked about was like the NPM should kind of just makefile like be able to figure out which order things need to run in within a workspace.
Actually, that is possible today, right? So like exactly your example, if you do run, npm run whatever, as long as there's no asynchronous tasks within that script, and that would be the case.
No, but that's what I'm saying is that almost invariably in a monorepo, you have one package doing a build script, and then the next package consuming the built output and then using it in tests. And if I want to run tests in both of them, and B depends upon A's build output, and A's test script does the build, then I have to run A and wait until it's completed before I try to run B. And that's NPM absolutely has enough information to know that that's necessary. And my opinion is that NPM should just always have done that by default, and there's no other behavior that makes sense. That if I want to run them in parallel, there's a ton of ways on the shell to run commands in parallel. The valuable thing is to run them in dependency order, the way that Makefile has done for 40 years.
So we could potentially fix this in V9, right? Queue this up as something that we just want to make by default.
Conservatively in V9, absolutely, and that would be great. Obviously it would be nice to ship it in V8 by a flag and then switch the flag in V9, because that way people can test it out. But
yeah,
but yeah,
we could try to do that. So it could literally be include dependencies as a flag, and then we remove the flag, make it the default. I want to be mindful of folks that might want to potentially opt out of that. I don't know, like, is there a use case for like opting out of like?
Well, that's what I mean is I'm sure there is a use case, but if you had that behavior by default and you wanted to opt out, you would just type multiple npm run commands, and you would, you'd use like concurrently or parallel shell or something, and you would run them in parallel, right? Or you would type each one with an ampersand after it, and then wait for them all to be finished, right? Like there's tons of ways, if you have multiple things that run serially, to run them in parallel. The thing that is hard is automatically applying the dependency graph ordering to a set of tasks. And that's the thing so in other words, like, I think that if we have to inconvenience someone, we should be inconveniencing the people who need to run it in parallel, because that's a much easier problem to fix, like by many orders of magnitude. That said, we could easily come up with a config flag that, like by doing a config flag, we go between these two behaviors, and who cares if they want to opt out of it, they can, but the default should eventually be, I think, this behavior, because that's what I would be very shocked if anyone expected anything else.
Yeah. Go ahead, Roy.
So yeah, I think I have two questions. Does this apply to any script really, or only for prepare, post install?
I would think anything. It's because I think it should apply to anything where NPM is doing things in more than one package, which only really applies to workspaces when you're running commands on more than one workspace. Like, the term, I keep screwing up the terminology, but like child workspace or whatever. Like when there's more than one of them in the list, they might have an interdependency relationship and thus an implicit ordering. They may not. And if not, they run in the current behavior in parallel, right? But if they do, then they need to run sequentially so that the second one doesn't start till the first one finishes. And I just can't conceive of anyone who would really want it to do anything different, because they already told NPM B depends on A, so A has to go first.
Right.
It's an interesting thing. Let's say the use case, which I think was brought up 2 weeks ago, was beyond build. Let's say test. Let's say. So if I run test, is it going to run all of my dependencies?
Yeah. So if
test
B depends on A, what's the point of running B's tests if A is broken? Why do I care what B's tests say if B's tests are all automatically broken because A's tests are broken? Until A's tests pass, B is irrelevant.
I guess isolating like problems and not like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like if I have one test failure in A and 1,000 in B, and 999 of them are because of the failure in A, like there's no value in looking at the B output until I've resolved the A problem.
So yeah, let's go beyond test then. Now, arbitrary script, right? Arbitrary script name, which happens to be in both workspaces that depend on each other in B and A. I go into B, I run that script. Do we run that script also in A?
So I would say, yes, you run it in A first and then B. And if the only downside to doing that on the off chance that they're not dependent on each other is that things run a little slower, but they still run correctly. They all still work. So the outcome's the same. It's just a little slower. That's the negative of doing this by default. And then somebody can either choose to run them in separate commands or provide a little flag and like switch to the parallel behavior. But like the correct by default is, I think, always a good approach. And slow is not incorrect. It's just annoying. Slow and correct is always a better default than fast and wrong.
That's what we aim to be, right? Like, to be honest, like that is the mandate that I have for our team, is that we are the most accurate, and we are
so that's what I'm saying. It's like if somebody happens to have magic knowledge that A and B, that the foo script of A and B can be run in parallel, awesome. Let them opt into running them in parallel. But without that magic knowledge, it's not safe to run them in parallel. They should be run in order based on that dependency relationship.
Yeah, I definitely agree for the example of like prepare, right? That will run a build script. So if A depends on B, like you definitely need to build B first, right? Before building A. But in this example of test, I don't think I agree. Like, I think I would want to run the test for A, even though I didn't run tests for B. Like, it's just test, right? Like, so B has already been transpiled. Like, I should be able to just run tests for A. Like, I could opt out, like you say. Like, maybe I just want to opt into the parallel.
I'm sorry. So I think that here's the confusion. If I type in my command, run B's tests, I'm not saying that should run A's tests.
Okay.
If I type in my command, run A's tests and B's tests, it should run A's tests first and then B's tests later. Right. I'm not talking about running scripts implicitly in a project. I'm saying that out of the set of project script combos that I'm already explicitly asking to run, only run them in dependency order by default. When such a relationship exists.
Okay, but you're talking about defining them.
I'm saying they already have. If I have A, B, C, D, maybe C and D don't depend on anything, and B depends on A. I already have that make file order dependency graph of jobs set up. It's there. NPM knows it. So I should be able to run A, C, and D in parallel, and then when A is done, it'll run B, and then if they all succeed, the command succeeds, and if any of them fail, the command fails. Like that's how it should work by default, is what I'm arguing. Now, but either way, if I just run the test something on B, it should only run on B because that's what I asked it to do.
Yeah, but you're talking about then running like NPM test and then targeting all the workspaces. It's kind of the
the default thing is I want to run test for everything. And then if that's the case, and I have 50 workspaces, I don't want to have to figure out the dependencies. I want NPM to just do it for me and get all the tests run.
Okay, that makes sense. But I would just also argue that, maybe if you want to, let's say, run prepare for A, and A depends on B, and B also has a prepare script, then we should maybe run prepare for B, even though you're only targeting A, right? When you're running NPM run prepare -WA, so we're only targeting the A workspace, but because it depends on B, we run prepare for B2, like, and that, because I think that the subset of lifecycle scripts that are ran at the end of the install, at the end of a refi, those specific scripts, maybe it makes sense for them to always be kind of like following this chain of dependency.
I just want to be mindful, Luke, you've had your hand up for a while. Do you want to quickly jump in?
Yeah, a lot of overlap with what's already been said from when I raised my hand, but I just wanted to reiterate that we should be mindful of, the implicit versus explicit. And if there are commands that we'd want to be run implicitly, just make sure those are defined. I know we already have the docs page of when you run prepare, what other scripts run, but I feel like that as we add complexity here, and this is, I agree, this is necessary complexity. This is something that we should be taking on. So application authors and module authors don't need to think about this. But as we add this complexity, I feel like there's potential foot guns. And the one I would like to avoid is too much implicit stuff happening.
Right. I think to Roy's point as well, it sounds like we could scope it to just when workspace has been defined, when a workspace has been defined, that we are going to like essentially kick in this sort of like chained execution. Is that what you were saying, Roy? Like we can essentially scope this down instead of at like a top level at the project root. If I run npm test, it's not, we don't even know potentially how to run which dependency to run first to start with, versus if you run npm test dash wb, then you know that, you know, potentially B has a dependency on A, right? And then figures that out.
Yeah, but what I was saying is that makes sense for like the kind of prepare post install type of scripts, but maybe not for tests, right? Like test is the example of not wanting to do that. Maybe I just want to run the test for my A package, then I'm targeting npm test dash WA, and maybe I don't want to run test for B, right? So
it feels like we could do this work, flag it, right? At exactly what has been proposed here, include dependencies or something along those lines, whatever the flag would be called, and see if this is the behavior that people are opting into most often before we would make it the default.
Yeah, and I do like the example Jordan gave. I'm writing it down in the notes here, but it applies in case you're targeting all workspaces, right? So his point is very good. If you're targeting all workspaces, the npm CLI should be smart enough to figure out all these relationships and run things in an order that matters.
Not just the whole workspace,
sense.
just anytime you're targeting more than one, then omits that set.
Yes.
Okay, I think I totally agree with that. Apologies, we didn't get to the last two items here, but I know a few of the folks couldn't join today. We will be back next week at the same time, same place. Appreciate y'all jumping on today again, and hopefully you're staying healthy and safe wherever you are in the world, and we'll talk to you soon.